Bryan Freedman never expected to be caught in the crossfire of one of Hollywood's most volatile legal battles, but here he was deep in the guts and machinery of a celebrity lawsuit that suddenly had nothing to do with just defamation and a lot more to do with betrayal, power, and a pretty smiling actress who would stop at nothing to stay on her pedestal. And as the filed statements began to pile up and the internal communications leaked from behind closed doors, what began to materialize was not just a case study in legal strategy, but a testimony to how fame demands blood, and how Blake Lively, known for the role that had launched her into the public's heart, was quietly cutting people out, bleeding alliances dry, and pressuring the hands of both friend and foe alike in the late hours. Bryan found himself reading over emails exchanged from 1 year ago, a message from a production assistant turned witness on the run, who saw too much and was told too little, and what she sent in writing was the first thread that would unravel something far more vicious and animal than any press headline could encapsulate, because Blake had been grooming narratives long before the court fights ever started. She sheltered herself with goodwill and privilege, a web of image curated like an art form. And when Bryan stared at the contracts and influencer deals, the paper routes of who had been silenced, and how he understood something clear: this was not just a damage control campaign. This was a staged ascent, one climbed systematically by trading trust for throne. And the collateral was stacked not in millions of dollars, but in the burned bridges with other women, with former mentors, with confidants, now ghosts, and legal teams shattered by compromises the public didn't know about. Not yet, but someone like Ryan Reynolds, who was handling the personal blow behind the lens, or friends like Leighton Meester, who had stepped back quietly without making a news splash. And source by anonymous text claimed that Bryan had in the early meetings warned his clients of exposing too large a picture, because what was inside would turn fans into jurors and memes into confirmed testimony. And when the screenshots came to light, when the deleted comments and moderated subreddits all pointed to a hand pulling strings, not out of panic but preparation, Bryan Freedman found himself at the center of a storm not created by his opponent, but by his own client, who had kept too many secrets too long in the hope that the world would never dare to speak them out loud. The storm was not theoretical, it was real and tangible. It moved through inboxes and conference rooms, it rattled publicists and sent assistants into late night panics, deleting files, transferring calls, rerouting messages, because Blake Lively's fall from grace was no longer something that could be avoided. It was now something that needed to be managed. And from the outside, everything still looked pristine. She posted with a soft filter, smiled at events, gave statements that read like porcelain. But underneath there was fracture. And fracture doesn't lie, especially not to someone like Bryan Freedman, who had seen enough celebrity meltdowns to know when the mask was starting to slip. He knew the signs: the desperation disguised as strategy, the false confidence given to press liaisons, the denial of internal conflicts, while privately scrambling to plug holes in stories that no longer added up. He had watched this kind of empire collapse before, but never one this curated, never one this controlled. And it all went back to the betrayal, not of Baldoni, not even of the press, but of the people who helped build her platform, people who now sat in silence, or worse, on call lists for opposing counsel, ready to flip, ready to speak. And in Hollywood, silence is currency, and the minute the silence goes up for sale, the empire it protected is already gone. Bryan reviewed the transcripts from the influencer interviews, the emails where timelines were adjusted, stories rewritten, captions edited, and the entire narrative reshaped, not just to fight a lawsuit but to bury one. And what he found over and over again were fingerprints, not from an external crisis team, but from Blake's own inner circle. Her name, her phrasing, her branding, the way she weaponized innocence like armor, the way she played the victim in every press leak, while privately negotiating control over media cycles. This was not damage control, this was a plan built on sacrificing trust. And as the timeline synced up, it became impossible to ignore how many former friends, colleagues, collaborators had been discarded or quietly erased from her digital life, all while the public narrative remained one of empowerment and solidarity. And it was that hypocrisy that Bryan knew would be her undoing, not the legality of it, not the strategy, but the human part, the betrayal that could not be explained away, because the people she stepped on were not nameless, they had stories, and now they had platforms. And Bryan, sitting in his office, knew one thing clearly: the more Blake fought to hide the truth, the more dangerous it became when someone finally told it. What Bryan Freedman understood perhaps better than anyone was that the court of law was only half the battle. The real trial was already underway online, in whispers and reposted messages and silent unfollows and blank stares from people who once toasted to her brilliance and now deleted her number. And as the discovery process opened wider, what came pouring through was not just evidence, it was a record of neglect, a trail of voice notes and drafts and edited out names of collaborators whose creative work had been repackaged and whose voices had been excluded from the credit roll. Blake Lively had not simply built a career, she had designed it by absorbing the shine of those around her, and then moving on before the world could ask where the light really came from. And as Bryan reviewed the depositions, as he listened to staffers quietly admit how they had been directed to delay replies or redirect credit to her brand, he felt the legal lines blur into something heavier, something more human, the ache of being used by someone you trusted. And the stories echoed each other, people who had gone above and beyond, not just professionally but personally, who had believed in her, stood by her, and then watched their contributions disappear into a narrative that never had room for anyone but Blake. Bryan started mapping the names, not for court strategy but because the pattern was undeniable. The betrayal was systematic. And what made it worse was the polish, the smile, the self-aware interviews, the perfect sound bites about female empowerment that now rang hollow. And beneath it all, there was the thing no headline could capture: the quiet moments when people realized they had not just been cut out, they had been used. And in a town like Hollywood, betrayal is common, but betrayal dressed as sisterhood, betrayal cloaked in activism, hits different. And that's what Bryan knew the jury would see once they heard these people, once the illusion was peeled back, and underneath the soft pastel aesthetics and the effortless grace was calculation and hunger, and a relentless need to win no matter who had to be erased to get there. And the truth was, the cracks were already spreading, the supporters were thinning, and even the most loyal fans were starting to ask if they had been cheering for someone who had never truly deserved it. And as the court date drew closer, Bryan wasn't just preparing a defense. He was watching a legacy slowly collapse under the weight of its own lies. The real tipping point came not in court, but in a boardroom, a quiet meeting behind closed doors where contracts were being re-examined and partnerships reconsidered. Because while the public was still waiting for the bombshell, some of Hollywood's power players had already seen enough, and Bryan Freedman, sitting across from executives, could feel the shift. It was subtle but decisive, and it meant that Blake Lively was no longer considered a safe investment, not because she had lost her charm or her box office draw, but because the trust was broken. And no studio wants to be tied to a storm without knowing which way it will blow. He watched as project leads spoke in half sentences, and producers refused to confirm previous attachments. And the silence that followed every mention of her name was no longer respectful, it was strategic. And as the court documents expanded with new testimony from former assistants, agents, and quiet insiders who had nothing to gain but the relief of finally being heard, the case transformed into something far bigger than defamation. It became a reckoning for how success is built in Hollywood, not always through collaboration, but through careful extraction of credit and influence. And the one name that kept surfacing in the center of these conflicting stories was Blake Lively, not because she had committed an obvious crime, but because she had perfected the art of silent betrayal, of allowing others to carry her and then walking ahead as if they never existed. Bryan read statement after statement, people who described how they had been asked to revise timelines, falsify project origins, or remove specific names from team credits, all in the name of brand cohesion. And when he asked why they agreed, they all said the same thing: fear not of Blake herself, but of what would happen if they became inconvenient to her image. And that was the root of the storm, not the legal fight, not the allegations, but the fear that surrounded her. The silence she expected, the way she had created a world where no one could question her without being quietly erased. And Bryan now faced the impossible task of defending a woman who had turned even her allies into liabilities. And the closer he looked, the more he saw that this was not an isolated moment, it was a legacy of small cuts, a pattern of convenience, loyalty discarded at the exact moment it stopped serving the narrative. And for the first time in his career, he began to wonder if he could win the case and still lose everything else. Bryan Freedman had always believed in the power of evidence, the kind that could not be spun by publicists or diluted by social media cycles, hard data, time-stamped communications, financial trails. But this case was different. It lived in the gray area between perception and manipulation, and it was in that space where Blake Lively had thrived for years. She had mastered the art of graceful omission, saying just enough to be praised but never enough to be pinned down. And now, as her empire started to splinter, Bryan watched as the same tools she once used to shield herself were turning into weapons for the other side. Leaked screenshots, whispered audio messages, metadata proving selective leaks, and worse, voice memos from internal meetings where content strategy was not about authenticity, but about distraction, crisis baiting, and rebranding fallout before it arrived. And what shocked him most was not how calculated it was, but how calm she had been in those recordings. Like, this was not a panic response, but a long-held practice. And when one former collaborator submitted a statement claiming she had been pressured to backdate credits on a wellness campaign so Blake could claim creative lead. It became clear this case was no longer about protecting reputation, it was about exposing the structure built on the reputations of others. And as the days passed, Bryan received call after call from media outlets, not for quotes but for confirmation, because they had their own sources too, and they were beginning to connect the dots between the sealed filings, the quiet brand exits, and the influencers who had stopped posting in support of her altogether. And the picture was growing clearer with every silent defection. This was not a smear campaign, this was an unraveling, and it was happening because the truth was too loud to suppress. And while Blake Lively's legal team tried to frame the narrative as exaggerated retaliation from a disgruntled former colleague, the receipts were unignorable, too specific to align to be coincidence, and the defense grew thinner, not just in court but in culture, because audiences had seen enough curated redemption arcs. They wanted real answers. And Bryan now faced an impossible truth: his own client may have orchestrated one of the most precise betrayals in modern Hollywood, not out of malice but out of strategy. And as he sat in his office replaying the latest leak, a 2-minute clip of a call where Blake approved a plan to subtly phase out a former collaborator without telling her, he knew the tide had fully turned, because this was no longer about winning a case, it was about surviving the narrative that would remain long after the verdict was read. By the time the pretrial hearing arrived, Bryan Freedman could feel the shift, not just in the courtroom but in the air outside the courthouse, where reporters, influencers, and former fans now gathered not to cheer but to watch the spectacle unfold. And inside, the legal proceedings moved with surgical coldness, every motion, every objection, every admission dissected under fluorescent lights. And behind those sterile exchanges was a growing awareness that this was no longer a standard defamation case. This was the dissection of a public persona, a forensic breakdown of image maintenance, and the emotional cost paid by everyone who helped build it. And as the court accepted into evidence a series of deleted messages retrieved through encrypted backups, what was laid bare was not just intention but strategy: texts that showed scheduling of leaks, notes instructing assistants to seed talking points, language that mimicked concern but was crafted to control. And for Bryan, it was like watching a body being dissected piece by piece. Each message, each file, a rib cracked open to reveal how the heart of her brand was never as pure as it seemed. And what disturbed him most was how much she had compartmentalized not just her team, but herself, a version of Blake that spoke publicly in feminist quotes, and another that in private saw her peers as threats to be managed, not supported. And now those same peers were returning to the courtroom not as enemies but as truth tellers. They had no coordinated agenda, no group strategy, just the shared experience of being used and left behind. And when the judge asked for clarification on a timeline, Blake's attorney hesitated just long enough for Bryan to know that even her inner circle was starting to fracture, and the most dangerous crack of all was beginning to show on her own face, because for the first time since the case began, she was not performing, she was reacting, and he could see it in the way her eyes scanned the room, calculating who was watching and what they might say. When the court recessed, Bryan stepped outside, not to breathe fresh air but to recalibrate, because he realized that this case would not end in that building. The verdict would matter, but not as much as the story being written in real time by journalists, by creators, by everyday people who were watching the fall unfold and rewriting their understanding of who Blake Lively really was. And the irony was painful: the very machine she once used to rise was now amplifying her undoing, and no legal argument could stop what people had already decided for themselves, because in the age of exposure, truth no longer needed to be proven, it only needed to be believed. When the final day of pretrial ended, Bryan Freedman sat alone in the quiet corner of the building, papers scattered around him, the weight of what he had witnessed heavier than any verdict could deliver, because this case had stopped being about legality and become something far more permanent. It was a reckoning not just for Blake Lively, but for the industry that created her, celebrated her, and protected her for so long that it forgot to look deeper until the damage was done. And now, as testimony prepared to go public, and more names came forward, from makeup artists to former co-founders to brand partners who had been nudged into silence or compliance, the story that emerged was clear. Blake had not simply betrayed people, she had systematized it, weaponized familiarity and gratitude, turned private vulnerability into leverage, and framed it all with soft lighting and controlled press cycles. And the most devastating truth was that she had been so good at it for so long that even those closest to her never realized they were being used until they were already gone. And Bryan, who had defended actors and executives and moguls alike, knew that this was different, because the betrayal was not hidden in fine print or masked in legalese. It was personal, it was emotional, and it had left scars that no courtroom ruling could erase. And as he packed his files, knowing full well that the trial would bring more headlines, More leaks, more public collapse. He also knew that the damage was already done. Because the one thing Blake Lively could not reclaim was trust, the silent belief that her words matched her actions, that her image reflected her values, and once that was broken, no Instagram caption or crisis consultant could fix it. And in the coming weeks, she would walk into a courtroom not just to defend herself but to face the stories of those she had silenced, and for the first time the spotlight would not be hers to control. It would be a mirror, one she could not dim or direct. And as the press gathered outside and cameras clicked with a different kind of hunger, Bryan stepped into the hallway and knew that this case would follow them all along. After the transcripts were sealed, because it was not just about who won or lost, it was about who we choose to believe and what happens when the person we believe in betrays that belief over and over again until even their silence sounds like strategy. And in the end, the final truth was not about the messages or the contracts or the influencers. It was about how a woman who had everything still felt the need to take more, and how in doing so she lost the one thing she could never get back: the people who once believed in her enough to stay silent and who now had no reason left to keep her secrets.